In the late 18th century, France would undergo a significant political transformation that would have a lasting impact on French politics and society, what would quickly become known as the French Revolution. Yet to understand these changes, we have to understand what drove them. The 18th century was a period of transition. It saw the emergence of new political ideas, as well as new political and cultural movements that would transform Europe. During the century, kings began to acquire a greater power as they subscribed to a new political philosophy, absolutism. This system saw the king as the sole authority in society, and typically, these ideas were supported by the church and clergy, who claimed that kings ruled through divine right. It stressed that kings and the nobility were naturally fit to govern society, resisting any notion of popular or democratic participation. Alongside these ideas, another movement was also taking shape during the period, one broadly categorized as the Enlightenment.
It consisted of various philosophers, political thinkers, reformers, and writers with different opinions. But in spite of this diversity, there did remain some common threads linking various movements and ideas together. Enlightened thinkers emphasized that man was rational. In possessing reason, they argued, man could understand and shape the world that he lived in. They rejected the old standard sources of authority, namely classical knowledge in the Bible. Instead, enlightened thinkers put their faith in the empirical sciences, in secular ideas of natural law that stood outside the domain of religion and notions of divine providence. In all these claims, the Enlightenment would propose a new way of viewing the individual in society, and this inevitably translated into new political ideas as well. And among these new thinkers, there were two principal ones who collectively proposed what would become the basis of the liberal democratic state. In his assessment of what made a government legitimate, the English political theorist John Locke argued that good and just government was based upon a social contract. In a society, Locke believed, the individual willingly surrendered a portion of their rights and freedoms to ensure that the rights of all society were protected against tyranny and injustice. Naturally, Locke's theories reflected the constitutionalism of England, and they played an important role in the establishment of constitutional monarchy in the country during the late 17th century. According to Locke, the most fundamental rights were life, liberty, and the right to own property, or state. Legitimate government based on the social contract was required to ensure that these rights were guaranteed to all members of society. For Locke, therefore, people came together within a civil society in order to resolve conflicts and promote the common good of all. To ensure that the state did not acquire too much power and violate the rights of the individual, Locke claimed that political power had to be separated, with various branches of the government serving as a series of checks on one another. In this way, the social contract could be honored, and the liberties of people fully realized. Locke's ideas became very popular among thinkers during the 18th century. They proposed a new model of government unlike any that had existed on the European continent. Yet, Locke was hardly the only theorist to pose new forms of governments in accordance with the principles of liberty and reason. In France, the political theorist Jean-Jacques Rousseau published his views on the social contract, opening his treatise with his famous declaration, Man is born free, but everywhere he exists in chains. For Rousseau, government was not necessarily a question of preserving the liberties of the individual, as it was for Locke. In fact, Rousseau found Locke's theories on individual liberties lacking. What was to prevent individuals from dominating others in a society for their own personal gain or interest, Rousseau wondered. More to the point, government was a constraint on the people. And unless it was the people who held power in the government, they would continue to exist in chains, as Rousseau put it. It was therefore essential to ensure not only liberty, but equality as well. And in order to do this, political authority had to be subordinated to what Rousseau called the general will. The general will was an expression of what was good and beneficial for society as a whole, or more pointedly, an expression of the interests and desires of society, not just the individual. In order to realize the general will, people had to be able to freely participate and make their own society, Rousseau believed. This entailed that sovereignty in any society derived directly and explicitly from the people. Locke had never specified what type of political organization was best for society. As long as a government abided by the social contract, it was considered just. On the contrary, Rousseau did not hide his preference when it came to government. According to him, only a republic, a government in which the people ruled as equal citizens, could arrive at realizing the general will and working toward the good of all. Rousseau's republicanism was a far cry from the absolutism of European monarchs. It affirmed not only that a government should have the consent of the people, but that it should be the people's government.
In 1776, many of these new ideas were put into practice when British colonists in the Americas rebelled against royal authority. The American Revolution saw the creation of a new republican state, the first of its kind. As American patriots waged a war for independence against the British monarchy and empire over the next 7 years, enlightened thinkers in Europe took note of these events, seeing in the American Rebellion a potential model contrary to the old system of royal patronage and aristocratic rule that governed Europe.
French thinkers had paid close attention to what had occurred in America. They read about the colonial rebellion and war in newspapers, and intellectuals discussed these events in salons. Previously, the principles of the Enlightenment had been relatively abstract. Republican government and natural rights had been discussed and philosophized over, but they had never really been applied or put into practice. This, however, had now changed. Enlightenment thinkers looked at the American government and saw the promise of a new era on the horizon. If an enlightened government had been set up in the backwoods of America, one could certainly be created in France, the heart of European civilization and Enlightenment thought. French elites identified with the struggles for liberty taking place in the New World, going as far as to claim that this struggle was not simply an American cause, but one applicable to all people. Traveling through France in 1789, the British traveler Arthur Young was conscious of the new atmosphere emerging in the country, remarking that there now existed a strong leaven of liberty increasing every hour since the American Revolution. Traditionally, the Estates General was composed of three bodies: the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate, or namely everyone else. Typically, the clergy and nobility voted the same way, and since voting was done by house rather than by the number of delegates in the actual body, this meant that the nobility and clergy typically outvoted the third estate 2-1. Yet in 1789, delegates from the third estate intended to alter this conventional arrangement. They sought to change the procedure for voting, insisting that vote should be done by person, not by house. Since the third estate was the largest of the two bodies and possessed the most delegates, this process would unquestionably give it an advantage. Louis naturally refused, preferring to negotiate with the traditional allies of the crown, the clergy and the nobility. This refusal drew protests from representatives. Angry delegates claimed that since the third estate made up roughly 98% of the country, they, and not the privileged classes, represented the nation. This was a bold claim, with delegates of the third estate effectively claiming to represent the voice of the people. Foremost among these delegates was the provincial clergyman and political writer, Emmanuel Sieyès. As the Estates General was being gathered, Sieyès had posed the question, "What is the third estate?" in a political pamphlet. In this blatant attack on the absolutist system, Sieyès spelled out his position clearly, arguing in favor of a French national community bound by common law and a single will. The nation was the whole, he insisted. It was everything, and therefore the third estate had a right to speak on its behalf. References to the French nation had been growing over the course of the 18th century, but they had little precedent in French politics. Under the monarchy, sovereignty resided in the person of the king. It was in the king's name alone that all political decrees and all laws were proclaimed. To speak on behalf of the nation, let alone to declare it an authority, was virtually unheard of, leaving a certain ambiguity as to who or what this French nation actually was. Nevertheless, impressing their demands on the king, delegates were willing to make bold demands, and they increasingly justified them through the new political idiom of the nation. In June of 1789, the Third Estate, after being constantly rebuffed by the king, went as far as to declare itself the legitimate government of France. It called itself a national assembly that claimed it had the authority to speak on behalf of all Frenchmen. And as the voice of the nation, it claimed the sole right to draft a new constitution for the country and create a government founded upon the principles of the Enlightenment. With this latest demand, the delegates were clearly issuing a direct challenge to the authority of the king and monarchy. But Louis was in no position at the moment to stop them. That summer, news of the events taking place in Versailles began to circulate around Paris, and it was not long before this political agitation soon mixed with more general social discontents. A series of poor harvests over the preceding 2 years had resulted in food shortages in both the countryside and French cities. In Paris, the price of bread had risen sharply, hitting every working family's budget. Goaded by hunger and scarcity, bread riots began to break out in the summer of 1789. People formed mobs and raided silos in search of grain. Bakeries were ransacked. Rumors even spread that the better-offs were hoarding grain to drive up the price and maximize profits. In these agitations, anger was increasingly directed at the upper classes, resulting in the condemnation of the aristocracy and the landed nobility. As order broke down in cities and the countryside, news of the events at Versailles began to circulate, giving a conspicuous political dimension to these riots and protests. Certain spokespeople in Paris began to suspect that the king might send in troops and suppress these movements. They even accused that the king was plotting to crush the National Assembly recently set up in Versailles, and with it, protect the absolutist system by force. On July 14th, 1789, Parisians motivated by fear descended on the Bastille, a royal armory located in the center of the city. The people, it was argued, needed arms in the anticipated fight with monarchist forces, and the cannons and weapons housed in the Bastille were their best bet. When the commanding officer at the armory refused to hand weapons over to the mob, the crowd stormed the building and overran it, dragging the commander and his men into the streets. In a fit of rage, the crowd butchered the men, cut off their heads, and paraded them around the city on pikes. Back in Versailles, Louis was meeting with his advisors when news of what had occurred at the Bastille was delivered to him. Listening, he turned to his advisors, asking, "Is this a revolt?" "No, sire," one replied to him soberly. "It's a revolution." The coming events were to prove this assessment correct. News of the violence carried out against royal authorities sent a wave of panic throughout the kingdom. Nobles began fleeing the country, fearing for their lives. When the delegates in the National Assembly learned that the Bastille had fallen, they realized that the situation was now teetering on the verge of anarchy. With little time to spare, the delegates took charge. They precipitously declared an end to the absolutist regime and took upon itself the responsibility of all governing powers, hoping to temper the rising popular outrage and provide a point of authority that could rein in mob violence. This latest gesture marked the beginning of a French Revolution, which, from its very origins, was marked by violence and bloodshed. Having assumed power, the National Assembly faced a number of difficult tasks if it intended to command authority. Firstly, it needed to create a new and legitimate government, a task that compelled the drafting of a constitution. This would require forging a broad consensus on what type of government to create, a question that was by no means universally agreed upon. While radicals insisted that France should follow in the footsteps of Americans and be done with monarchy altogether, most delegates had little faith in the ability to found a republic. A constitutional monarchy with limited powers bound by law was preferable to most. Yet even this denouement had its own issues. If the king was to be bound by a constitution, what were the extent of his powers? Should the delegates imitate Great Britain, or should they devise a constitution in accordance with the traditions and customs of the French government? As these questions were debated and argued over, other events rapidly took their course. In early August, the National Assembly declared an end to the social privileges of both the clergy and the nobility. a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was drafted. According to this document, all sovereignty resided in the body of the nation, not the king. All people, as citizens of the nation, were entitled to the same rights and duties, making them fundamentally equal in the eyes of the law. Feudalism, an institution tied to the old regime, was officially abolished in the name of equality. In a single gesture, the entire social and economic system of the kingdom was dramatically overturned. Yet while revolutionaries spoke in the name of equality, it was evident that many felt this should pertain to civil rights alone. Under the new constitution produced by the National Assembly, voting rights were not given to everyone. Political rights were only extended to males. A voter had to be able to understand the duties which citizenship entailed and use their reason to make informed political decisions. And according to French politicians, this was something that only men, and not women, were capable of. Secondly, the assembly differentiated between active and passive citizens. Active citizens were required to meet a tax qualification in order to vote. This entailed that political rights were given primarily to the nobility and middling classes. Passive citizens were able to enjoy all the civil rights that citizenship offered, but they were not empowered with the vote. This effectively meant that women, the working class, and peasants were all excluded from political power. The Assembly also agreed that it was going to form a constitutional monarchy in France. Establishing a democratic republic seemed far too radical for most delegates. Most wanted to work with the king in finding a resolution and keep the monarchy at the head of the nation, albeit a monarchy beholden to a representative body. This idea was popular among many progressive thinkers who admired England's constitutional monarchy. But for more radical politicians and journalists, it seemed as though many of the delegates were not going far enough in their reforms. If the Assembly abolished the old feudal order, it equally sought to transform the other pillar of the old regime, the Church. In the summer of 1790, the Assembly passed an order requiring the civil consent of the clergy. This law effectively imposed state controls over religion, making priests and clerics salaried employees of the state. It forced them to swear allegiance to the Constitution and the new government. Many were loath to do so. The majority of clerics supported the king. For them, a society founded on the ideas of the Enlightenment was an ungodly and wicked society. Moreover, neither the Pope nor Louis agreed to the law, making it illegitimate in the eyes of many Catholic representatives. The government's relationship with the religious establishment was also impacted by its social and economic policies. To raise money for the new government, the Assembly appropriated all church lands and began selling many of them off to speculators. This infuriated the clergy, which was coming to interpret the revolution as a blatant attack on religious institutions and the church. Catholics began to rally to an opposition platform, expressing their disagreement with the delegates and the principles of the new government they had created. As these Catholic opponents became more vocal, it was evident that divisions were beginning to emerge. There were revolutionaries, but there were also counter-revolutionaries. And by the early 1790s, the revolutionary government was becoming ever more unpopular in light of its controversial policies. As fears over counter-revolutionary activities grew, rumors circulated. Those mistrustful of traditional social elites accused the clergy and nobility of secretly plotting to overthrow the government. These accusations were not entirely fabricated, as nobles connected with the royal family began to create armies abroad and organize a resistance movement. Fears of a counter-revolutionary backlash provoked more radical views to come to the forefront of politics. Some began to claim that if certain groups proved reluctant to accept the revolution, it was necessary to impose it on the nation by force. They even used Rousseau's notion of the general will to justify their position. As these radicals saw it, the revolutionary program was beneficial for society as a whole, even if the general population did not yet know it. Radicals in the assembly also began to express a more hawkish outlook. Encouraged by the people's conquest over the absolutist state, some politicians began to claim that France should actively spread the revolution's fundamental principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity to other nations. France had a moral obligation to export the revolution, they argued. Having liberated herself, France should now liberate other oppressed people who remained under absolutist governments in kingdoms like Austria and Prussia. Such warmongering was fueled by anxieties over international counter-revolutionary conspiracies. Radicals had little trust in monarchs, and they were convinced that conservative forces abroad were assembling armies and plotting to invade France and restore the absolutist system. These existential threats urged immediate action, prompting radicals to call for a war against Europe if necessary. As these more radical voices began to emerge and find an audience, Louis realized that he could no longer support the assembly. On a more basic level, he began to feel that his life was possibly in danger. In June of 1791, therefore, the king and the royal family decided it was essential to flee the country and join the community of aristocratic émigrés abroad. With the help of loyalists, the royal family disguised themselves and fled the palace unnoticed in the middle of the night. Yet just near the Belgian border, the king was recognized and the authorities alerted. At the town of Varennes, police apprehended the royal carriage, placing Louis and his entourage under arrest. The royal family was summarily brought back to Paris as political prisoners. The flight and capture of the royal family seemed to give substance to the warnings issued by radicals. In their view, the king had been fleeing to seek aid abroad, and he could no longer be trusted. With the abortive flight of the king, the position of moderates and the hope of a constitutional monarchy was severely placed in doubt. With royal authority discredited and the counter-revolutionary conspiracies of radicals seemingly validated, tensions were beginning to grow. The French Revolution was becoming increasingly radicalized, setting the revolution on a new course, one which had hardly been imagined in the enthusiastic first days of 1789. From the moment the Estates General was called in 1789, delegates spoke of regenerating the French people. This term had come from Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau. Philosophers contended that societies abided by natural laws, and these natural laws governed all human societies. In their opinion, a society either progressed or it degenerated into barbarism, and for many, it appeared that French society had entered a period of decline. Even before the revolution erupted, reformers under the monarchy had spoken of regenerating the country. In order to do this, the government would have to be reformed, effectively restructuring the monarchy and state and setting them on a solid foundation once again. Yet for others, the idea of regenerating France possessed more far-reaching consequences. The delegates sitting in the Estates General insisted that a century of absolutism had degraded the French people, morally and socially. They had become habituated to servitude and obedience under the rule of oppressive kings. These qualities were hardly the mark of a virtuous people, and correcting them required drastic restructuring. This challenge, they believed, was central to the revolution unfolding in the country. In essence, delegates did not seek a return to a golden age or a perfect past. Revolution was intended to revive both people and country. It would mold the provinces and mass of peasants into a new people and create a new and vigorous type of society. This desire for a new beginning increasingly became a central idea of the revolutionary program as the revolution continued. The revolution was intended to transform a divided mass of individuals and social groups into a single and unified people, what theorists were now calling a nation. In short, revolution expressed an idea that the French people could be made anew, and a new society born from the ruins of the absolutist state. This conception would underpin a key theme in the unfolding of the French Revolution. It was not conceptualized as a return to a golden age. Rather, it was to be a process of radical transformation. And it was these ideas that gained popularity as Louis and his family were carted back to Paris as prisoners of the nation. The monarchies of Europe watched cautiously as these events unfolded in France. Not only was Louis XVI a distant relative of the Austrian Habsburg Emperor, he was also a symbol of royal absolutism throughout Europe. In a broad sense, the fate of the king held importance for the fate of absolutism on the whole. Upon learning of the king's capture, Austrian and Prussian representatives met in the German city of Pillnitz, and there issued a public declaration to the revolutionaries. If the royal family was harmed or molested in any way, they warned, it would be considered a cause for military intervention. Back in Paris, radicals quickly turned this declaration to their advantage. It substantiated their claims of royalist plots, they argued. The crowns of Europe were clearly flirting with the idea of invading France and restoring the king to the throne. Rather than waiting for the inevitable, radicals built upon these fears and called for a preemptive strike against conservative forces. In April of 1792, the revolutionary government declared war on Austria and endeavored to rally the country around a patriotic military campaign. Frenchmen were instructed to fight for their country and defend the values of liberty and equality against royal absolutism. Traditionally, the majority of the military command had been drawn from the nobility. But the nobility was now fleeing the country. The army raised by the government was therefore hardly a professional one, and at first it performed quite poorly. A series of blunders and defeats in Western Germany that spring and summer brought Austrian forces right up to the French border. By late 1792, it suddenly looked as though the nation might be invaded and the revolution suppressed. The threat of invasion sent a wave of fear through the country, and these circumstances empowered a new group of men rising to predominance in the country. These were radical Republicans, and unlike the more moderate deputies sitting in the National Assembly, they were skilled at delivering energetic speeches and courting public opinion. They set up political clubs and made dramatic appeals to the people in public, thriving in the new ambiance of debate and democratic politics created after 1789. These radicals called themselves Jacobins, named after the old Parisian monastery in which they held their meetings on the Rue Jacob. Not all Republicans were as fiery and brusque as the radical Jacobins. Other Democrats, grouped together under the title of the Girondins, formed a political faction within the movement that attracted men hailing from the southwestern department bearing their name. While the Girondins were no fan of king or royal government, they resisted the more radical rhetoric and policies of their Jacobin cohorts. To them, the radicals appeared like mad dogs, enragés as they like to call them, men on a mission who seemed to throw reason and pragmatism to the wind for the sake of an angry politic. Leading this radical faction was Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer who had become active in politics with the outbreak of the Revolution in France. An avid reader of Roman history and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Robespierre stressed the idea of public politics and the virtuous citizen, believing that political men should be ardent patriots capable of animating the people and defending the natural rights that belong to all. He was an antagonistic critic of wealth and fond of labeling all property owners in the countryside, whether rich or of moderate wealth, aristocrats, who, by their very nature, were enemies of the people. Following Robespierre was the young Louis de Saint-Just. Only 21 when the revolution began, Saint-Just had initially entertained aspirations of being a poet. In his poetry, he commonly addressed political themes, often condemning modern society for the inequalities in wealth and power it seemed to produce. As his poems and stories tended to sell poorly, he turned his attention instead to politics. In time, Saint-Just would become popularly associated with the radical wing of the Jacobins and see through some of the most atrocious and violent acts of the revolution, earning him the nickname the Angel of Death. The lawyer Georges Danton was another patriotic Republican who came to the forefront of political life with the revolution. His despise for royal government had made him one of the key spokesmen against the king and Bourbon family, and his ability to organize crowds made him a valuable ally to the radicals. It was Danton who was among the first to accuse the royal family of treachery, and following the king's flight and capture, it was Danton who mobilized crowds in support of jailing the king and overthrowing the entire dynasty in place of a republic run by the people. There was also Jean-Paul Marat. With the outbreak of revolution, Marat had turned his attention to sensationalist and fiery political journalism. The scandalous and at times completely fabricated attacks he ran on other politicians in his paper L'Ami du Peuple had made him suspect in the eyes of many government officials. Fearing that he might be arrested, Marat had gone into hiding, taking refuge in the Paris sewers, which exacerbated a cutaneous skin disease that would plague him for the rest of his life. As the French army suffered a series of defeats on the battlefield, these radical voices began pressing the National Assembly to begin rounding up any individual suspected of being a spy or counter-revolutionary agent in the country. Some leaders in the local Parisian municipal government began forming their own militias to hunt down suspected traitors. The Assembly hardly condoned this behavior, but it was powerless to stop it. Members of the nobility and clergy were imprisoned on the merest suspicion of treason, and soon enough, jails began to overflow with these suspected traitors. The question of what to do with these prisoners was never entirely clear. A series of long debates ensued, as political representatives argued over whether trials should be held and what procedures should be followed in determining guilt. For some, this talk and debate appeared too slow. The enemy was advancing, and those detained were clearly guilty in their eyes. And so as the government debated, more militant radicals decided they would take action. On September 2nd, 1792, an armed group of workers and local radical leaders broke into the major prisons, seized the detained suspects, and summarily executed them in the courtyards. The September massacres, as the event was dubbed, amounted to some 1,400 deaths, the majority of them priests and nobles arrested on the flimsiest charges. These massacres soon spread outside the capital as radicals encouraged citizens to root out suspected counter-revolutionaries and defeat the enemy within that threatened democracy. Urban laborers and working-class groups organized militias and carried out atrocities against supposed political enemies. These sans-culottes, so called because they did not wear the fashionable silk pants worn by more well-off members of society, were die-hard radicals, enragés with a grudge against anyone possessing wealth and social status. These militias were veritable nurseries for the extremism and militancy touted by Jacobin leaders. They provided them with an army of radical laborers and working-class militants calling for unbridled justice and violence against anyone who might subvert the revolution. The question, however, was could the Jacobin leadership control these bands of artisans and workers? This was not clear. Events like the September massacre suggested that these sans-culottes might prove a volatile force that would act on its own will, leaving questions as to whether the Jacobins could in fact control the popular anger and resentment they were fueling. Shortly after the September massacres, the Jacobins began drafting a new constitution for the nation, which would provide the political institutions they desired. Resisting royal authority, France was to be a republic, not a constitutional monarchy as had originally been hoped. Befitting this republican form of government, every adult male was given the right to vote, inaugurating universal manhood suffrage and establishing a democracy unlike any that had previously existed. A constitutional convention was to be elected to write the new laws for the country and handle the war effort. Yet when elections returned a majority composed of the Girondins and liberal-minded deputies, radicals refused to accept the results. Insisting that the dire situation called for bold leadership, they purged the convention and filled it with their own supporters. More frightening still, the convention drafted a new constitution and declared France a republic in late 1792, but the body summarily suspended the constitution it had just proclaimed. The threat to democracy was too dangerous in the country, Jacobins insisted. Counter-revolutionaries abounded. The nation needed to be cleansed and citizens educated if liberty was to be defended. Revolutionary government, rather than democracy, was to be the order of the day. Of course, the Jacobins also needed to ensure that they could control their sans-culotte base as well. Free institutions might empower angry workers, and the Jacobins had no intention of being led by the mob. They wanted to lead it. As the radicals understood it, democracy needed to be protected, and this required very undemocratic means to ensure its survival. Terror and virtue, Robespierre proclaimed, were now what was demanded of all good citizens. Terror directed at the revolution's enemies, and the virtue of all patriotic citizens ready and willing to defend the newly created republic from its enemies. True to his declaration, it was decided to bring public enemy number one to trial, namely Louis XVI. Tried in a revolutionary tribunal set up by the Jacobins and found guilty of crimes against the nation, Louis was charged with treason and sentenced to death in January of 1793. Traditionally, the call upon the monarch's death was, "The king is dead, long live the king." But on the January morning when Louis was executed before a crowd of his former subjects, the call that rang out was, "The king is dead, long live the nation." Having seized control of the government and put the king to death in the name of democratic virtue, radicals were bent on accomplishing a revolutionary mission unparalleled in history, they claimed. Yet for many others, these were worrying signs of things to come. In particular, the Girondins were coming to believe that radicals had gone too far. It was easy to see that Robespierre and his allies were on the verge of setting up a dictatorship. Elected to office, radicals were coming to believe themselves infallible, claiming they were in fact the voice of the people. Robespierre was quickly becoming Rousseau's general will incarnate, as he persistently claimed to speak for the entirety of the nation. Inclined to see enemy plots everywhere, radicals were determined to ensure that the values of the revolution persisted. It was imperative, therefore, to push through the revolution by any means necessary in order to save it. Worse still was not only that the radicalism was becoming infectious, it was encouraging a new extremism on the right, as opponents reacted to the purges and massacres carried out against them. In March, the violent anti-religious campaigns spearheaded by the Jacobins against Catholics and priests drew reprisals from peasants. That spring, a virtual civil war erupted in the region of the Vendée. In these struggles, peasants and Republican nationalists sparred off against one another, committing murder and carrying out horrific atrocities against entire communities as the country descended into anarchy. Taking account of these growing conflicts, the Girondins were now adamant that the working-class radicalism fed by Jacobin firebrands needed to be extinguished and order restored to the country. Meeting in secret, they planned to orchestrate a coup against the radical leadership and break up the lawless revolutionary militias. Yet this attempt to wrest control from the radical leadership resulted in an abysmal failure when the Girondins proved unable to muster the force necessary to unseat their radical adversaries. Once the Jacobins learned of this treachery, they began hunting down anyone associated with the Girondin movement. An open war between Republicans was now added to the chaos, as the Girondins regrouped in the countryside and prepared to lead a campaign against the radicals in Paris. In July of 1793, Jean-Paul Marat was sitting in one of the baths he took regularly to soothe his skin condition when a knock came at the door. Opening it, his servant found a young woman, Charlotte Corday, who reported she had just come from the countryside with information regarding an imminent Girondin plot against the government. She requested an audience with Marat at once. Entering the residence, she sat beside Marat in his bath and began recounting the details of the coming Girondin attack that was about to take place. Yet as she conveyed this information, Corday drew a dagger from her cloak and plunged the weapon into Marat's chest, killing him. A Girondin sympathizer, Corday had shrewdly carried out an assassination on one of the top Jacobin leaders, using Marat's persistent obsession with plots and political intrigue to gain access to his personal quarters.